Hey guys, Mrs. Berg here. So today we're going to be talking just a little bit about clauses. We're going to do like a brief overview of what clauses are and what the different types of clauses are. And then we're going to quickly talk about how to diagram them. And then I'll show you a few examples. So we're going to start by talking about the difference between independent and subordinate clauses. So some of this should be reviewed from like elementary school for a lot of people, but basically all clauses, like what specifically makes a clause is that it has its own subject and verb. And we have to be careful because sometimes the subject and or verb could be implied within the clause, but every clause, that's kind of what defines a clause, is that it has a subject and it has a verb. So like that would distinguish a clause from a phrase, right? Phrases do not have their own subject and verb, but clauses do. So we have independent clauses, which a lot of us know can stand alone by themselves as a sentence. They have a subject, they have a verb, and they express a complete thought. So we have to know the difference between independent clauses and then these subordinate clauses, which a lot of people learned to call them dependent clauses. So subordinate clauses and dependent clauses are the exact same thing. I don't know why they have two different names, but they do. So there it is. And I like to say subordinate clauses because I think it makes me sound fancier. So subordinate clauses, what they do is they will function by adding more information about independent clauses, but they cannot stand alone by themselves as a sentence. So even though they have their own subject and their own verb, they do not express a complete thought, which is why they are not independent. And they'll typically be functioning in like either an adjective or adverb capacity where they're adding more information about certain words, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. But the other thing to know about subordinate clauses is that they always begin with a subordinating conjunction. And I do have some examples of subordinating conjunctions up here in the upper right hand corner. And this is not by any means an exhaustive list. It's not even extensive. There are so many subordinating conjunctions that you can have begin subordinate clauses. And then some other words will begin subordinate clauses as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the presentation here. So just kind of keep your eye out for those because that will indicate that you have a subordinate clause. But just know that if you have a group of words that has a subject, has a verb, but doesn't sound like a fully complete thought, like if you were to walk up to somebody and say it, they would look at you like you're crazy, or they'd be like waiting for the rest of your sentence. You have a subordinate clause. Okay. The ways in which clauses are put together determine the type of sentence that you're dealing with. And I'm going to be kind of blocking this, so I'm going to move myself up here. So these are the different types of sentences that you guys are going to see, and we're going to talk about how we can kind of put some of these together. So a simple sentence contains just one independent clause, has a subject, has a verb, expresses a complete thought. As you can see here in this example, I kicked the ball, right? Subject I, verb kicked, expresses a complete thought. A compound sentence is when you hook together two or more independent clauses, and we'll talk about this on the next slide. There are only three ways that you can hook together two or more independent clauses, and I'll give you the formulas for that. But basically, you should see two sets of subject-verb combos that express a complete thought. So we already talked about this one, but then here it is the subject, hit is the verb, and then it hit Tom expresses a complete thought. Complex sentences, what they have is they have one independent clause and then one or more dependent or subordinate clauses. So you can see here, Tom cried is our independent clause. We have a subject, we have a verb, it expresses a complete thought. If you were to say that to somebody, they would understand what you're saying. But this part here, we start with one of those subordinating conjunctions because, and then because the ball hit him. If you were to walk up to somebody and say, because the ball hit him, they'd be like, what? What are you talking about? So that's how we know it's a subordinate clause. Okay, it starts with one of those subordinating conjunctions. It still has a subject ball. It still has a verb hit, but it doesn't express a complete thought. So it needs to be attached to that independent clause. And then compound complex is where you have two or more independent clauses and then one or more subordinate clauses. And you can kind of see that example there. Pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so let's start by talking about how we diagram compound sentences. So remember, that's when you have two independent clauses joined together. So a little bit to know about these. Compound sentences are when you have two independent clauses joined together in one of the following ways. So there's literally only three ways that you can join together two independent clauses, and they are as follows. You can do a comma fanboy in between your two independent clauses. Now, a fanboy is an acronym that stands for the coordinating conjunctions for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so I forgot the S. It's supposed to be fanboys. I apologize. I'm just going to draw that in there really quick. So fanboys. Okay, so if you have two independent clauses joined by a comma and then one of those coordinating conjunctions, then you know you have a compound sentence and you know how you're going to diagram it, which we'll get to in just a second. You can also hook together two independent clauses just with a semicolon. I love using semicolons. I think people are a little bit scared of them, but really easy way. You can just slap it between the two. You, of course, anytime you hook together two independent clauses, you do want to make sure that they are closely related to one another. And then the third way you can join together two independent clauses is the fancy way. You can use semicolon plus a conjunctive adverb plus a comma in between your two independent clauses. And I know conjunctive adverb, you're probably looking at that like, what's a conjunctive adverb? Well, you've probably used one of them before, okay? Here's a very extensive list of your conjunctive adverbs. So you can see a lot of like, really, what's the word I'm looking for? Common words on here. However, I think is one of the most common words, and I have no idea where it is in this very exhaustive list. Oh, there it is, right there. However, also, nevertheless. Okay, and remember, when we put them between two independent clauses like this, you have to have that semicolon preceding it and then the comma after. And I see errors with this all the time in writing. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, when we go to diagram these compound sentences where we're hooking together two independent clauses, the way that you're going to do this is you are going to join the verbs of the two independent clauses. So each clause will be diagrammed on like its own separate line, but then you'll hook them together with a dotted line connecting the verbs, and then you're going to place the connector. So whatever comes between the two clauses, whether it be a comma fanboy, a semicolon conjunctive adverb, comma, you're going to place that on the horizontal line. So here's what it's going to look like. So you'll have your first independent clause here. You'll have your second independent clause here. And then between the two verbs with a dotted line, you're going to hook these two together. And then whatever's joining them here, I just put conjunction, right? Because this is our most typical way to join is with that coordinating conjunction. You'll just put that right there between the two verbs connected with that dotted line. So we're actually going to practice with an example sentence here. So here's the example sentence. I am just always in the way. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to keep moving myself as we go here. Oops. And I need to delete my S. Let's delete the S. All right. So let's take a look at this sentence. This is a compound sentence. Okay, we have two clauses. She forgot about it is our first clause, and then she never intended to come is our second independent clause. We are joined with a comma fanboy. So we're joined with one of those coordinating conjunctions here. So what we want to do is we always want to start by labeling the subjects and the verbs and then anything else, like any other complements that we have going on or prepositional phrases or whatever. Okay, so here, let's just start with our first independent clause. We've got she is our subject. Forgot is our verb, and then about it is a prepositional phrase that's telling us more information about what she forgot, right? So about is going to be our prep, and then it is going to be the object of the preposition. And then we want to just label our second independent clause. So we're looking again for another subject verb combo. So our subject in the second clause is she, and then our verb is going to be intended. Never is an an adverb that's modifying the verb intended. And to come, you have to be careful here, okay, because to can be a preposition, but since this to is followed by a verb, this is actually an infinitive, okay, infinitive, I'll just, sorry, this is very hard to do with the mouse, infinitive, and here our infinitive is functioning as the direct object of our sentence, okay, and I did go through how to diagram verbals, which is what an infinitive is, in a previous video, so just make sure if you're not sure how to diagram that, you go back and watch that video. All right, so now we have all the pieces labeled, so we can go ahead and plug this into a diagram here. Remember, we're diagramming both of our independent clauses on separate lines, so we'll start with this first independent clause, she forgot about it. So, wow, that was really bad. I apologize. That was a very not straight line, but it'll work. All right, so we're going to put our subject there. We separate it from our verb with that straight or vertical line that goes through the main line. And we have our verb over here, forgot. Okay. Oh, man, this is looking brutal. Sorry about it. And then we said our prepositional phrase about it is modifying forgot. So we're going to put that underneath forgot, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to abbreviate because this is really hard. So you'd put about on the slanted part, and then you'd put it here. Okay, then we want to diagram our second independent clause on a completely separate line. right? So we're just going to make another line down here a little bit better. And again, we've got the subject she separated from the verb intended. And I'm just going to abbreviate. Never abbreviate on your diagrams, but just for the sake of moving faster. Never is under intended. And then we said to come is our direct object. So we have to separate that from the verb with this little vertical line. And then remember, since it's a verbal taking the place of a noun, we got to do these little chicken feet. And the infinitive has this top to the chicken feet. So the to is going to go here, and then the come is going to go here, just like that. Okay, and then we just have to join these two clauses together. And the way that we're going to do that, remember, is we're going to do doop, 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 this dotted line. We want to put our coordinating conjunction in between. So we will put or on a little line like that, and then boop, 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 connected to the other verb. So that is what that diagram would look like for our compound sentence. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I gotta get used to this. Back and mouse, and we're moving on. Okay, now we're going to talk about adjective clauses, and I'm going to move myself here a little bit. So adjective clauses, what they do is they modify nouns and pronouns, just like typical adjectives do. When you have a whole clause that's modifying a noun or pronoun, the whole clause can be functioning as an adjective. They usually directly follow the noun or pronoun they modify, so they are pretty easy to spot because they're going to come right after the word that they are giving more information about or modifying. And they are going to start with either relative adverbs or relative pronouns. And I have all of those relative words written there. So just kind of keep your eye out for those relative adverbs or relative pronouns, because they will be starting an adjective clause. And again, it'll directly follow the word you're modifying. And we'll look at an example here in a minute. Sometimes the relative pronoun, however, will be implied and not directly stated. And that happens a lot with the word that. Like a lot of times the word that is going to be implied and instead of directly stated. So just kind of keep your eye out for that as well. Keep your eye out for that as well. A little grammar humor for you. It's fine. So to diagram adjective clauses, what you're going to do is you're going to connect the relative pronoun or relative adverb, okay, to the clause that it modifies with a dotted line. So here would be an example. So again, we're going to have two different clauses that we're trying to connect together, right? So we have to diagram each clause on its own diagram. So this would be like your independent clause, and then this would be your adjective clause. And in this version, we have our adjective clause modifying the subject of the sentence. So we connected it with that dotted line. If it was modifying, the object of the sentence, you would instead connect it to the object of the sentence. So just whatever word it's modifying, just put that little dotted line in between. So we are going to do a little practice here. And again, I'm going to have to move myself. Sorry, we're just playing a moving game. It's a lot of fun. Everybody loves it. All right, so again, we just want to kind of determine where are our clauses in this sentence so that we know kind of where we should be diagramming. So Sarah Boone was the woman who invented the ironing board. And if you kind of pay attention to those, those relative pronouns, those relative adjectives, you should be able to identify it right away. So this is going to be, I'm just going to call it our relative. All right, this is going to be the subject of our adjective clause. So we can kind of make that our subject of our relative clause, who invented the ironing board. So you'll always have your relative pronoun or your relative adjective functioning as like the subject of that clause, and it will have a verb that's attached to it. So I think since we already started here, we'll just continue on with this relative adjective clause here. So invented is going to be the verb that goes along with that relative subject who. So who invented, we ask ourselves, since this is an action verb, what to find the direct object, and board is our direct object of that clause. The and ironing are both modifying or describing board. So then we have to label our independent clause here. So Sarah Boone, because it's a proper noun, it's capitalized, is going to be our subject of this independent clause. Was is a linking verb, so we're going to replace that with an equal sign. So Sarah Boone equals, and then woman is going to be our predicate nominative, and the is modifying woman. So now that we have this all labeled, we can draw our diagram. And remember, you draw a separate diagram for each of your different clauses. So we'll start with this main clause here. Put this at the top. Oh, look at that line. That was beautiful. Okay, and again, I'm just going to abbreviate, but you're going to write out the whole thing. So Sarah Boone is our subject. Separate it from our verb, which is was. And then we have a predicate nominative. So we do a little slanted line. And then woman is going to go here. The will go underneath woman. And then we want to do our relative adjective clause on its own diagram as well. So we're using who as the subject, separate it from our verb invented, and I'm going to abbreviate that one. And then we have a direct object, so we do vertical line, separating the verb and the direct object, board, the and ironing go underneath it. And I'm sorry, I'm just putting the first letter because this is a little challenging. Now, the one thing that we did not talk about what this clause here is describing or modifying. Because remember, since it's an adjective clause, it's giving us more information about a noun or a pronoun in the sentence. And remember the rule, adjective clauses typically directly follow the word that they're modifying. So this entire relative clause here is giving us more information about the woman. So what we're going to do on our diagram is we need to connect this relative pronoun to the word woman on the other diagram. So it would literally just be cute little dotted line like that. And there's your diagram for your adjective clause. All right, now we're going to move on and we're going to talk about adverb clauses. And I'm going to have to move myself again here. So adverb clauses, just like typical adverbs, they're going to modify verbs, adjectives, adverbs, or verbals in your sentence by telling where, when, in what way, to what extent, under what condition, or why. Okay, so these questions are really kind of key to remember, because if you can answer one of these questions with your clause in relation to another word in the sentence, then you're gonna that's like your indicator that you have an adverb clause that you're dealing with. So the adverb clauses also are going to begin with a subordinating conjunction. So if you can kind of keep your eye out for those subordinating conjunctions, you should be able to tell where your adverb clause is, because the adverb clause will be a subordinate clause, giving more information about something in the main independent clause. In elliptical adverb clauses, okay, the verb or both the subject and the verb may be implied and not directly stated. And I did mention this earlier on where when you have a subordinate clause, you could have a subject or verb that is not directly stated, it's more implied. So just kind of keep your eye out for that. So to diagram these types of clauses, what you're going to do is you are going to connect the verb of the adverb clause down here to the word it modifies in the main independent clause, and then you'll write the subordinating conjunction on the dotted line. So in this example, we have our subordinate clause modifying the verb of the independent clause, and then we put the subordinating conjunction on that dotted line there. But it could also be modifying an adverb or an adjective, or it could be modifying a verbal, like maybe we have a verbal as our direct object. Okay, so you just got to kind of like pay attention and really think about what is this clause modifying, and these questions are going to be really helpful to help you determine that as well. Okay, so let's take a look at this example here. Let me remember here again, and then get my pen ready. So this example, and one thing that I love is when you have a sentence that actually starts with a subordinating conjunction, and this one is kind of a compound subordinating conjunction because it has a couple of words. So as soon as is our subordinating conjunction in this sentence. Whenever you have a sentence that starts with a subordinating conjunction, it's always going to be separated by a comma from the independent clause, which is kind of nice because like big neon flashing sign saying, hey, here is a subordinating conjunction. However, when a subordinating conjunction comes after the independent clause, there's no punctuation between them. So then you really have to be able to keep your eye out for those subordinating conjunctions. So just kind of keep that in mind. So we have our subordinate clause here, and then we have our independent clause here. We have to label both of them, and then we'll plug it into the diagram. So we'll start with as soon as the job was finished. So we already identified as soon as our subordinating conjunction, which will go on the dotted line between our two clauses. Job is our subject. The is modifying job. Was is our linking verb. And then finished is telling us when it was finished, I believe. Nope, I lied. Yep. Okay, how do I erase? We're just going to clear it. All right, so as soon as subordinating conjunction. I'm sorry, I messed up. Job. was. Linking verb, job equals what? Finished is the predicate adjective describing the job. Okay, and then that's modified. Now we've got our independent clause. So our independent clause, dad is our subject, gave is our action verb. Dad gave what? Money is our direct object. And then we've got some stuff in between. So we want to follow up with the question to whom. Dad gave money to whom? Because her is our indirect object. So we actually have an indirect object in this sentence as well. And then some is describing the amount of money that was given. Okay, now we are ready to diagram this bad boy. Now, one thing about this, whenever you have a subordinate clause in a sentence, you always want to diagram the independent clause on top. So we're actually going to put our independent clause up here. We're going to have the subject, dad, separated from the verb gave. Oh my goodness, this is ridiculous. And then we've got our direct object, money. I'm just going to put the money sign. And then our indirect object, remember, always goes underneath our verb. So we're going to have her here, and then we'll put some here. I'm just going to put a little S. And then we want to diagram our subordinate clause below this, again, on its own line. Okay, so we're going to ignore the subordinating conjunction for now, and we're just going to diagram the main components of the clause. So job will go here, separated with a verb was. And then we've got predicate adjective finished. And I'm just going to put being. Okay, and I think, oh, and the. Don't forget the. It's really easy to forget those little like filler words. I have my students do it all the time, and I do it sometimes as well. Now, the one thing that we did not figure out yet, we haven't figured out what this subordinate clause is modifying or describing in the independent clause. Okay, so we can use those adverb questions from the previous slide to kind of help us figure it out. Okay, as soon as the job was finished is telling us when she was given the money. Okay, so this whole subordinate clause is answering that adverb question when in relation to the verb. So we are going to connect these two clauses with a dotted line between the two verbs, okay, from the verb in the subordinate clause to the word it's modifying in the independent clause, which also just happens to be the verb. Okay, so we're just going to put like a little weird dotted line here. And then don't forget, you have to put that subordinating conjunction on that dotted line as well. So I'm going to put as soon as, and you would actually write the whole thing out, but I am struggling with this. So that is how you would diagram that adverb clause. All right, moving on. Here we go. This is our last one. Noun clauses. Okay, so noun clauses, they are always going to function as a noun would in a sentence. So there are only certain places that nouns can be within any given sentence. So you can have a noun be the subject of a sentence, a direct object, an indirect object, an object of a preposition, or an appositive. So noun clauses can function in any of those ways. Words that introduce a noun clause are similar to other clauses. So, for example, like you'll have subordinating conjunctions that could introduce a noun clause or relative pronoun or whatever it might be. But the thing with the noun clauses, like you can tell the difference between a noun clause and an adjective or adverb clause because usually noun clauses can pass the it test, which means if you identify the clause and you think, okay, I think this is a noun clause, if you replace the entire clause with the word it, the sentence should still make sense. And I'll show you an example when we get to our example sentence on the next slide. So to diagram these noun clauses, what you're going to do is you're going to place the actual noun clause on those chicken feet. Because remember, I talked about this in a previous video on how to diagram verbals, but the chicken feet, they actually indicate that you have a unit in a sentence functioning as a noun that doesn't typically function as a noun. That's what those chicken feet indicate. So you will just put the whole clause on top of the chicken feet wherever it's functioning in the sentence. And if you have a word that has no function in that clause, which a lot of times you will, you'll just put it above the verb, just kind of like this. All right, so let's take a look at what this might look like. And I'm just going to leave myself there. Yay, I'm not in the way. I know that he will find them. So here we have this relative pronoun that, and that is introducing our noun clause here. I know that he will find them. Now, here's the it test. Okay, if this component right here is our noun clause that he will find them, right? Because we have to have a subject, we have to have a verb, and this is a verb phrase, and then them is telling us who they're finding. Sorry, I just kind of diagrammed that really fast. Okay, if we replace that entire noun clause with the word it, the sentence still makes sense. I know it, right? Still makes sense. Okay, so it passes the it test, which means we did correctly identify that it is a noun clause. Now we just have to figure out, okay, how is it functioning within the greater independent clause? So let's diagram this part. I is our subject. Know is our action verb. So if we have an action verb, we ask ourselves the question, what? I know what? I know this entire thing, that he will find them. So the clause itself is functioning as our direct object. And now we are ready to diagram this bad boy. All right, so drawing my line here. We start with the subject of our independent clause, I, separate it from the verb know. Okay, and then because we identified the noun clause functioning as a direct object, we put it in the spot where a direct object would typically go. So we have to have that direct object line between the verb and the direct object. And remember, we put the entire clause on these little chicken feet because the chicken feet indicate that you have a component in the sentence functioning as a noun that doesn't typically. So then we would want to draw another line for our clause to diagram it. So then you just diagram it as normal. So we got he as our subject. So he will go here, separate it from the verb, will find, and I'm abbreviating, separate it from the direct object, them. Okay, and then we still have this word that. Now remember, if you have a word in a sentence that really has no function, all you do, little dotted line above the verb, put it on a pedestal, and just write it in, that. And there you have it. Now you have learned how to diagram all of the different types of clauses that you are going to encounter along your grammar journey. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you have questions, go ahead and reach out to me with a comment or an email. Have a great day.